So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Friday event of the school year of academic year 21-22. I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, and we're delighted to have a growing participant group of maybe 100 people out there to watch our panel today and hopefully ask some good questions at the end and have a good conversation. We do these events usually the first Friday, although this month, avoiding Labor Day weekend, every month. And next month, we'll be focusing on parks and recreation and outdoor space and the new faces in that area. And that'll kind of be a combination of the excess demands on that whole system in Colorado and elsewhere during COVID when people wanted to get outside in a safe place, but also the DEI issues around access and inclusion to those spaces. And so we're excited to have that event. We're also launching a new certificate program at the School of Public Affairs in Parks and Recreation that we'll talk about a little bit. And then November, we'll talk about election issues. There aren't a lot of big candidate elections, but there are 13 ballot initiatives in Denver, several more at the state level, and maybe even more importantly, redistricting and reapportionment of Congress and the state legislature, and the state has an 8th congressional seat. So that's exciting. So we'll talk about that. And then in December, very sadly, our head of our Center on Domestic Violence, Barb Paradiso, passed away about a month ago. And that's a center that she built over 20 years at the school. And we're going to talk about the center itself, what we'll be doing going forward, and also the issue of domestic violence, which in many ways was another issue affected heavily by COVID. We have an exciting agenda for the fall and hope you'll join us in those other events. I also want to quickly note tomorrow, September 11th, the 20th anniversary. There's a lot of activity, a lot of events around that. It's a sober time, certainly for the 3,500 Americans that died and their families. And it led to lots of events that all of us have been dealing with over the last 20 years, including the most recent pullout from the war in Afghanistan. And so there's a lot going on in public affairs generally, and we're excited that you're joining us for this conversation. And about a couple of months ago, when we planned this event, we titled it Philanthropy After COVID, and we were hopeful that vaccinations and the general environment would be better today. We also hoped that we would be on the second floor of the terrace room eating breakfast together and doing this in person, but unfortunately, that's not our reality right now. And so certainly the discussion today will, after COVID will be kind of in quotes, but the general thought was that, a lot of the folks that you see on the screen today, their organizations were undergoing new strategic plans, new thinking, a lot of DEI focus in philanthropy, and then COVID hit, and that, put some of it to the side to deal with the immediate issues of COVID, but also redoubled kind of the equity issues because the pandemic itself has been so problematic in that regard. So I'm very excited about our discussion for the next hour. As we get to the final 15 minutes, or even before that, please put some questions in the Q&A, and Jamie, our moderator, will get to those, and we'll end around 1 o'clock. So again, thank you for being with us. I'll introduce the panel quickly, and then Jamie as moderator, and then pass the baton to him. We have a terrific group of people here that work in local and national foundations. I'll start with Dr. Janet Lopez. Janet is actually in transition right now. She's told me this is her first day off and she shouldn't be working, but she's here with us. She spent 10 years or so with the Rose Community Foundation and is taking a new job as Senior Director of Policy Partnerships and Learning with the Denver Foundation in a couple of weeks. And Janet, prior to working for the Rose Community Foundation, worked at CU Denver as the P20 director and had a number of other jobs in education and higher education before that. So thanks for joining us, Janet, today. Lindy Eichenbaum-Lent was Janet's boss, actually, until yesterday at the Rose Community Foundation. Lindy has led the Rose Community Foundation through a new strategic plan that came out, I think, around the time of COVID. So that'll be interesting to hear about. Lindy, prior to that, was head of the Civic Center Conservancy in downtown Denver, and prior to that worked for Mayor Hickenlooper, maybe Governor Hickenlooper too, I can't remember, now Senator Hickenlooper, but we're delighted to have Lindy here as well. Also with us today, Kelly Duncan. Kelly is the head of the Community First Foundation that serves Jeffco. Very proud that Kelly is an MPA alum of the school. She previously worked at the Colorado Health Institute and an organization called 10-10-10, which addressed wicked problems with entrepreneurial solutions. She's also got a background in education and has spent some time in South America working on similar issues. We're also just joined by Mike Johnston. Appreciate Mike being here with Gary Community Ventures. Mike is the president and CEO of that organization. He's been a state senator. He's been a principal in schools. He's been an education reformer. And I want to particularly thank Mike and his organization for starting COVID Check Colorado, which CU Denver took great advantage of in terms of testing our students, faculty, and staff and dealing more quickly with the COVID problem than we ever could have done. And so Gary Community, I think, has also gone through some rethinking about some of their directions. So we've got a lot of organizations that are thinking about all these issues, and we've got great people here to talk about that. Our moderator today, Jamie Van Luen, is head of Director of Youth and Community Engagement for the Emerson Collective. He holds a PhD from the School of Public Affairs, which we're very proud of. He has previously worked for Governor Hickenlooper and in homelessness issues in Denver and in Colorado and a number of other issues. And many of you probably know Jamie. He's one of the best networked people, I think, in our state, and also travels a lot. And it looks like he's at home in Denver today, but on other days he might have been in Hong Kong or Uganda, where he formed the Global Livingston Institute, or other places that he's been in recent years. So I'll hand the baton to Jamie, and looking forward to a great panel. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Paul, and I'm really excited to be here with people who are both colleagues and really close friends of mine. And so I was actually thinking, as we were getting ready for the panel discussion today, I was reflecting on 9/11, and it's interesting because most of the panelists that you're going to hear from today, I've known since 9/11, and it's interesting because we've all learned from each other, and we've all grown better at what we do in the community because of the work that we've been able to do, not just individually but together. I've learned so much from Lindy and her approach to how we communicate and connect with community. I've learned so much from Mike in terms of the way that we engage and activate young people. And I think with Kelly and Janet, it's how do we make sure that we create a seat at the table for everybody who needs a seat at the table. And so and that started all the way back for me when I was at Urban Peak during 9/11 days, when we actually had to, as a community, figure out how we were going to respond to, at the time, probably the most serious issue that had ever confronted our generation. And now 2 decades later, as we're reflecting on that, we have another issue that is definitely challenging the fabric of our community and how we approach things. And I think that the one thing that all the panelists and myself share together is a deep-rooted respect in how important it is that we do this together. That if we are not at the table together and not figuring these things out together, we're in serious trouble. And I think you're going to hear that today, and it will come through. I'm excited to hear some of the perspectives of the work that the foundations are doing to respond to this, and especially how we're thinking about this moving forward. As Paul referenced, I think what's so challenging about this, and it's probably very different than 2 decades ago when we were confronting 9/11, is that things are literally changing every month, and things that we thought we were going to be dealing with a month ago can be extremely different than what they are today. And so our panel today, in terms of where we're convening, is an example of that. So I'm going to get us started, and I thought we'd just jump into some questions. And I think I'll lead with one of our panelists, and then let you all kind of respond to, as you all have insights and perspectives that you want to contribute as we go through these. And then I'd encourage folks, if there's questions that come up during the course of the conversation because of something somebody says, raise those, and we'll try to address those in real time. But we have some questions that I'm excited to to hear what my colleagues have to say. And so I'm going to actually just pick on Lindy. I'll pick on Lindy because actually Lindy was the person who had to communicate with me when she found out that I was coming over to the mayor's office and leaving Urban Peak to come work on homelessness with John Hickenlooper. And she and I actually worked together with then Mayor Hickenlooper to take on homelessness in Denver. Lindy, your foundation is doing amazing things right now. You've announced $2.2 million in grants to 46 organizations around addressing DEI issues. You are a leader and a spokesperson in this community, and a lot's happened in the last 18 months. And so as we go into the fall and things look differently than they actually did as we were going into the summer, how is the leadership at your foundation thinking about where we go from here? Like, how are you taking on something that is constantly changing the way that you have to think about funding?
Tiny question. No simple answers. I kind of, if you don't mind, want to pick up really quickly on the 9/11 theme that you articulated, because I've been thinking a lot about, the question over the past 2 decades is, where were you when 9/11 happened, right? And I think we need to shift to, where are we now on the 20-year anniversary? And the differences between then and now are terrifying to me. As a person, as a parent, as somebody working in philanthropy, 20 years ago, our country was united by a horrible tragedy. Today, we are facing epic tragedies on a daily basis, and we could not be more divided. Then the threat was from foreign lands. Today, the threats are domestic. And so I think, in terms of your question of, we're in this kind of never-ending COVID saga, and where do we go from here? Those factors of division and threat domestically, I think we all have to be paying attention to. And what are the root causes? And what can we, regardless of whether our seat is in nonprofits or philanthropy or government, what can we be doing to get at those issues? Because this isn't sustainable for us as communities, as a society. I think we've been going through a sea change in philanthropy to begin with. And just to kind of bring it local, you see a lot of new foundation leaders on this panel, and we are certainly not the only ones in our ecosystem. So you've had these leadership changes, and in many cases they were generational shifts in philanthropic leadership. And so a lot of us have been thinking of and working on new strategic directions for our organizations before 2020, before COVID, before the racial reckoning. And so, it will forever be assumed this was all in reaction to, but it really wasn't. And so I think that speaks to what's next. If it was core before, it will be core going forward. So many of us were already centering equity in our work. Many of us were already leaning into trust-based philanthropy. COVID and the racial justice conversations certainly accelerated this work, and in many cases amplified it. But when these crises are finished, and they quite frankly may never be, it doesn't mean that work is finished. That the commitment to equity hopefully was validated by the events of 2020 and 2021. So I think philanthropy needs to not get distracted by the next shiny thing, and continue down this path of deepening their understanding of disparities, opportunities for systemic change, the role that equity plays across our systems, and a myriad of issues, because there's so much opportunity to do more.
Kelly, do you mind if I pick on you a little bit, as kind of building off of Lindy's piece? You represent a foundation that has been transformative in terms of Colorado Gives Day, and really figuring out ways to fully engage and activate the community. As you think about the work that you all are doing, and as you gear up for your next round, what does that look like for you all, and how are you thinking about this this changing environment?
Yeah, thank you. I think Lindy set the context beautifully for both what we were thinking about before, what we're thinking about now, and then what we'll be doing going into the future. And as Lindy and Mike, I'm a new foundation leader, and we just completed a strategic plan. And we opted to really more definitively define our community as Jefferson County. Our roots were here. We've always been working in Jefferson County. We're going to double down on Jefferson County. And one of the things we thought about is how well do we know Jefferson County? We may have had our offices here and been working in Jefferson County for a very long time, but how well do we really know this community? And do we truly understand what their priorities are, what issues they are worried about, what opportunities they want to take advantage of? So we've started, it's very rudimentary and we're working on it, but we're committed to listening. So it's everything from how do we take data from needs assessments to how do we capture information we heard at a community meeting, to how do we capture what community organizers are hearing from the individuals they're organizing around policy issues, and starting to put all of that data into formats that we can then reflect on to identify what are the needs that seem to be emerging, what are the issues that people in Jefferson County care about, because we firmly believe if we start to address the issues that people care about, we'll be able to garner more partners. And so I think that's, to your point, how do we engage the community? Well, first, it's by listening and understand what they care about. Second, letting them know we heard them by focusing on the things they pointed out are important, then garnering those partners to work with us. And we believe that if we have more partners working with us, we're likely to achieve greater success. If we achieve greater success, we'll be invited and trusted to more tables to listen more deeply, and we can create that flywheel effect for our work. We've also agreed that we will continue to operate Colorado Gives 24/7 online giving platform. I think people know it best for Colorado Gives Day, but it does run the other 364 days of the year. And one of the things we've done there is it's incredible what was built. And I can say that because I had nothing to do with it. All of the infrastructure that was built around Colorado Gives, everything that happened, the leaders before me were truly prescient because the year they launched Colorado Gives was the year the first iPhone came out. So nobody was shopping online, let alone giving online. And so they thought that they could create infrastructure that could be shared across the nonprofit sector. And so we had gotten it as far as it could go without really having someone in-house who understood digital product development. And so we have a new staff member who's focused on digital product development and looking at coloradogives.org as a digital product. And we believe that the ultimate audience for Colorado Gives is the donor. We give credibility to the donor that every nonprofit has been vetted, they're not going to get scammed. And then we want to make the experience great for the donor so it feels like an e-commerce site, because that's what people are used to. So hopefully you'll see some improvements in your checkout this year. You can let me know if they worked or didn't work. But then also how we create a platform going forward that is really beneficial to the nonprofits, because it's only beneficial to the donors if we have the nonprofits they're looking for on the site. So I think we're doubling down on how do we listen and how do we respond and how do we make experiences with philanthropy and with granting a little more personalized so people feel like they're being heard and they're being valued and their work is being prioritized.
Thanks for that, Kelly. That's really, really thoughtful and really interesting, especially from the perspective of Jefferson County. Janet, I'm going to pick on you just a little bit because you are a guru around the education piece, and you also have just an enormous amount of policy background. And you're welcome. I know you're starting a new role now, and so you're welcome to speak to that. But I'd be curious, taking that question, how is the foundation community thinking about this issue as it relates to education right now? Like literally policies in schools in the last 2 weeks have changed dramatically. And what does that look like? And what are your thoughts in terms of how we're approaching this?
Yeah. Thanks for your question, Jamie. I think it's very interesting. I've spent this week I've been talking to a number of school leaders, both sort of traditional public schools and also some public charters. And there's so much ambiguity right now. It was, we went from this point of actually like, we know we're remote all year. We've kind of figured this out over the last, 14 to 18 months. And then sort of what happens now that we move to this, this time where we thought we were probably going to be in person, that we weren't going to be wearing masks. And it hasn't happened in the way that I think people thought we would get past it. So I think, in terms of sort of philanthropy's role in public education, one of the really interesting things, I think on the sort of in the early days of COVID, there was a lot of energy and a lot of work that was really around and incredible support around very basic needs, right? Like kids need food and we need to figure out how and they need devices and they need technology. And those were easy, in some ways, those were easy things to solve for. And so philanthropy, I think donors stepped up, foundations stepped up and really made sure that folks had what they need in that moment. I think now moving forward, what I see is a sort of a really significant trend, where I'm going to the Denver Foundation, but also among all of my counterparts, and not that foundations didn't do this work before, but to sort of piggyback a little bit on Lindy's comment around sort of root causes, is like, how are we actually going to address root causes, and knowing that so many of them are systemic, leaning much harder into policy work. And so it's very interesting. I know that, the Community First Foundation has added a policy director. The Denver Foundation has a new policy director. Rose, in the last 2 years, that was the position that I was in. Mike has a very deep bench of policy people, but trying to think about, I think it's going to be interesting to see what the next moves are in terms of philanthropy, trying to figure out, dollars and resources will never be enough from, how are the federal stimulus dollars coming back and how do we solve problems? But then how do we also think about long-term, difficult, hard problems in public education? And what role is sort of systemic change through policy change going to play in that? So I definitely think that's sort of moving forward. Just Colorado philanthropy ecosystem is going to lead harder into that work.
Thanks, Janet. I really appreciate the policy piece and digging in, especially when an issue that I think is important to all of us and the School of Public Affairs. Mike, we'll kind of wrap up this first round of questions with you, but you've played both the elected official role and now a foundation leadership role, and you're having to figure out how to leverage resources, and you're doing that with the Piton Fellowship that you've announced, and you're doing that with engaging young people to tutor and participate in classrooms. But talk about that. What's your take on this as we think about how we should be addressing this as a community, and especially from the foundation chair that you're sitting in?
And mostly my strategy is I just call Lindy and Kelly and I ask them what I'm supposed to do, and they help me figure it out. So I think they all said very powerfully what I think the current context is. I'll just say one thing about, I think, the challenges that we see coming going forward, and obviously Janet motioned to this, but when we've looked at, Paul, I was just thinking, I've been attending these SPA meetings for probably 20 years and thinking through a lot of the issues we've been fighting, particularly around efforts to close the achievement gap. And when we look at right now, the academic fallout from the pandemic, what we're seeing is stunning. You probably saw this year's CMAS scores show the largest single year drop in Colorado history for student growth measures. If you look nationwide, not surprisingly, that impact is disproportionately falling on low-income kids and kids of color. And so it looks like it could be 10 to 18 months of learning loss for Latino and African-American kids in Colorado. The reason why I thought, Paul, of the old SPA events is if you take that in context, 10 to 18 months expansion of the achievement gap almost undoes everything we've done in the last 20 years to close the achievement gap. So you basically take every effort we've made since No Child Left Behind. It's taken us 20 years to almost close the gap that we may reopen in just 18 months. And so we are really intensely focused on how can we think about providing support to do that. I think there are two efforts we're excited about now. One is, to Janet's point, kind of what are the long-term public solutions? We're supporting a ballot measure called LEAP, which is on the ballot measure this November, which would provide a permanent public funding source for after school and summer school programming to help kids get access to tutoring or academic enrichment. Low income kids who we know don't have access to that right now. A big part of a kid's experience is the 8 to 3 school day, but as also us who are parents know, 70% of our kids' time is still spent outside of the regular school day. And that's where they get access to tutoring or to math camp or to science camp. And even when our schools are doing a great job from 8 to 3, those gaps are widening farther and farther based on out of school and summer school opportunities. And we also know if we're going to get kids caught up, we're going to have to do not just 8 to 3, but more. So we think this could be a solution to help make sure kids statewide that are low income and are going to have academic and other extracurricular needs could have an access to a chance to catch up and keep up. And then connected to that, we are launching also a program called the Learning League, which is a tutoring effort to help support in our first year 5,000 low-income students across the metro area with what we're calling an academic passport, which is a technology platform that tutors can use to help support kids from K through 8 on literacy and numeracy. But equally important that parents can use, that Sunday school teachers can use, that aunties can use, that the YMCA staff member can use for a kid that comes to drop in, so that we can empower every adult in a kid's orbit to be able to step in and help support them on the next step on their journey to becoming literate or numerate. And so we think this is going to take a full village to respond to this. And that means really democratizing in the way that Kelly has for democratizing giving. How do we democratize every adult in a child's life to be able to actually help in a productive way on one shared platform? And so that's the thing we're most worried about, and the thing we're trying to figure out how we can be a small part of the puzzle to solve.
Thanks for that, Mike. And I actually appreciate, I think hopefully folks are getting kind of a holistic response from all of you in terms of kind of the different approaches that folks are taking and looking at. Kelly, I'm going to go back to you. I want to talk a little bit as funders, and as you're making, we talked a little bit about how you all are thinking about it in the foundation community and whatnot. Can we dig a little bit deeper? And I'm going to start with Kelly just because she was talking about the different nonprofits that Colorado Gives Day will support and focus on. What are we hearing from our nonprofits in terms of how what's the landscape for them? This is having run nonprofits in my life, having been in the field. It's hard enough to do this work when there's not COVID. What are we hearing from the nonprofits, and how is that factoring into the funding decisions that you all are making in the community?
Yeah, I'll sort of share 3 things that we're hearing. I think one is they certainly want funders to have fewer restrictions, less red tape, general operating grants, longer term support. But I think what we've also heard from them is just as they're seeing they can do more and be more effective in their work when we put fewer restrictions on them, they can also be more effective in their work when they put fewer restrictions on the individuals they're serving. So we meet regularly with a lot of the food banks and food pantries in Jefferson County. And through the pandemic, they sort of got rid of all their rules around, tell us who you are, tell us your documentation status, anything, that sort of information they were collecting, and just said, you don't have to prove to us that you need our help. You showed up. We're going to assume you need our help and just provide help. And so they found that they've been more effective and they feel more connected with the individuals they're serving without that red tape, and they need support to do it because they'll tend to see more people. It makes it a little more difficult. So I'd say the fewer restrictions, both from the funders as well as what they're putting on the individuals they're serving. The second thing we've been hearing and we've been thinking a lot about is how do you fall in love with the problem rather than your solution? And so really trying to get closer to what the problem is, understanding what are the barriers for the communities you're trying to serve, and then tailoring solutions to meet their needs, rather than assuming that the food pantry that we've always had and we're going to make it look like a grocery store and people will love it is actually going to solve the problem. If the problem is, I'm afraid to get out of my car and come into your pantry because I have an autoimmune disease or whatever it is. So really getting close and falling in love with the problem so that you can choose a solution that's actually addressing that problem. And then I think the third thing we're hearing is how can we be really smart and strategic about the ARPA funds? So there's a lot of money coming in from the federal government in response to everything we've seen with COVID. And let's not squander this opportunity to build long-term sustainable programs or funding mechanisms that will have systemic change for many, many years rather than meet the needs just today. So those are three things that we're hearing.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Lindy, Janet, Mike, anybody want to add to that, or any other takes or perspectives you guys are getting from that?
I think this was referenced earlier, but, this hasn't changed from the beginning of the pandemic, where we saw nonprofits suddenly having to deliver services to their clients that was never their core function. So suddenly food access, technology access, mental health were critical things their clients needed, but that wasn't what their original function and mission was. And so the question is, how long will this persist, and how will it impact the long-term functions of the organizations individually and the ecosystem as a whole? Another thing we heard, particularly as we deepened our relationships with BIPOC-led grassroots organizations, is about access. Yes, we all have seen the data, and it's horrifying that philanthropic dollars have historically disproportionately flowed to nonprofits led by non-BIPOC leaders. And so I think there is a concerted effort to change that. But it's not just about grant making. Part of it is seats at the table, or connection. And so funders, I think, are looking at ourselves differently. I know we certainly are, in how can we open doors for grantee partners to be, a grassroots organization, to be in a grass tops conversation, to bring in that community voice and proximity to both the needs and the opportunities to these decision-making tables. So in addition to grant making, that's a place where we're putting a great deal of energy. And another that I'll close on is, when all of the federal PPP loans came out, we saw that the same historic challenges in banking that communities of color had in accessing capital and loans were carrying over into the PPP system. And so Community First Foundation and Kelly, the Denver Foundation, and Rose Community Foundation, the three community foundations came together to launch a Metro Denver nonprofit loan fund. 0% interest loans for prioritizing nonprofits in 7-county Metro Denver, led by and/or serving communities of color. And this is our hope to not only get at some of that disparity, but also to provide a safe on-ramp to using capital, to using loans, to building credit worthiness that hopefully benefits these organizations far beyond this crisis.
Thanks.
I was just, I think, building on, what Kelly and Lindy have already shared. I do think sort of emphasizing what we're hearing from nonprofits. And I think all of the strategic plans that the foundations sort of are in the Denver and Colorado ecosystem have responded is this flexibility and nimbleness around the general operating dollars. Because I think what we're also seeing is that organizations are learning to do their work differently, and they want to be able to have, the general operating dollars and sort of the flexibility that they're doing work differently and making an impact, and to be able to not worry about what did I commit to very specifically? Just a couple ways, again, knowing that this audience, it's sort of SPA, and thinking about sort of folks who are in the policy and advocacy world. Surprisingly, I think we've heard a couple things, that there are grassroots organizing groups that have reached more people than ever, because now anybody can get on a Zoom at 5 o'clock. It used to be that we had this meeting physically at this place, and it was really hard for, a family, a single mom to make it there with her kids. Now she jumps on. We're having the best year ever in terms of our engagement. And so you also, you think about are we staying relevant? Is philanthropy staying relevant and sort of staying flexible to think about the ways people are doing their work? So you think about youth organizing groups. One of the youth organizing groups that works mostly in the Latinx community, they have an entire staff person dedicated to social media and the TikTok and 2 TikToks. You can see that's how generationally I'm so old and busted. But, you know, like, are we staying relevant? Are we staying connected? Are we staying flexible to the ways that people are now, I think, like, innovating actually in this moment, and they won't go back to maybe doing the work the way that they did it. At least it's sort of the grassroots organizing way.
Thanks for that, Janet. And Mike, Cindy kind of has, it's kind of a nice tie-in question to build in about the role of housing stability, and especially the foundation you represent has done a lot of that work in the neighborhoods. But where does I thought Lindy's comment about nonprofits having to do something that never in a million years was in their strategic plan or their scope of work, other duties as assigned. Where's housing stability fitting in all of this, especially with our nonprofits, and what impact is this having on that?
Yeah, I'm so sorry I didn't get 2 answers for most urgent crisis facing the state, because I would have picked that and the education one side by side. I think if you only have to look at the cover of the Denver Post any given day to know how dramatic this crisis is at every stage of the housing market, both folks that are, I talked to the nurses at Children's Hospital who are leaving their job and leaving the state because they can't afford to either buy a home or even the rent. And when you're an RN and you're meeting what you thought was the apex of your career and you still can't afford to live in the community that you serve, I think we have a real crisis. So I think this one is going to be, to Janet's earlier point about the combination of philanthropy and policy and market solutions. This is going to be one that's going to require all of these silos working together. There needs to be both policy solutions to expand the supply of housing to make it more affordable. There needs to be public dollars that are not just one time, but permanent, to be able to support construction of affordable housing long-term. There needs to be more effort at helping people get access to home ownership. Right now, when we look at the single most profound racial gap in Colorado and in the country, is not right now the income gap, it is the wealth gap. In Colorado, for instance, the average white family has about 175,000 of accumulated wealth. The average Black and Latino family has about 12 to 15,000. So it's about 150,000 gap. And that has not been by accident. That's the process of deliberate processes of exclusion over 250 years that have prevented families from building wealth. And so we're launching an effort to build access to down payment assistance to help Black families increase home ownership. And so I think it's going to be both, how do we expand more supply of affordable units for rental? How do we get more working families into home ownership? And how do we make sure that we're partnering with market developers and with communities and city councils to create the right preconditions with the right revenue streams to solve that? Because right now we'd have to build 50,000 more units a year than we're building to just keep the prices we have now flat. If you want to actually bend the curve back, you have to increase the supply even more than that. And that's going to take a huge statewide effort. And so we think there are creative ways to do this that don't involve just sort of West Coast and East Coast and foreign developers coming and buying up buildings in Denver, jacking up the rents 30% and then selling them again and making a huge profit. I think there's a path for community-owned land property trusts that would be able to hold these apartments in perpetuity, and the revenues that come back in actually support building more housing, not extracting more profit. So I think there are some exciting things to do, but this one will take a big coalition of partners, and we're excited to try to be part of it.
Sure. Well, Mike, on that note, my friend Paul Deckert has a question that kind of takes us back to the opening remarks that Lindy made about 9/11, where we had a tragedy that actually brought the country together. And right now, if you look at our country and then hone in on our state, the divisiveness is profound. And in some ways getting exacerbated as the COVID crisis continues. And what you're talking about is really figuring out how to forge partnerships, because in order to solve some of these issues, affordable housing, education, gaps, that we're going to actually have to work together to do this. How are we thinking about that, especially from the foundation community? What role should the foundation community be playing in terms of addressing some of the divisiveness that we're seeing right now? And how do we bring folks back together to sit at a table, even though we might vehemently disagree about some of these issues? And I'll leave that to any of you want to take that on, or how you're thinking about it. I'd be curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, Jamie. I feel like that's one of the key roles we can play, as we're nonpartisan organizations, and we are only committed to outcomes. And I think that's actually a very Colorado sentiment, right? I think that most people are pretty pragmatic in the state and want to find solutions to hard problems. And I think they feel the political spectrum pulling them in both opposite directions. And what they'd like would be reasonable people to get together and say, what's the problem and how can we solve it? I think when you look at something like housing, it is a bipartisan crisis. You know, whether you are CEO of a company and you can't keep employees because they can't afford housing, or whether you're someone worried about opportunity for the folks that are farthest from it, this is one that hits everybody. And so we found really great interest from people on all sides of the political spectrum who said, we'd love to be a part of a coalition to figure this out. People won't always agree on what the strategies are, but I feel like us continuing to set and keep the table for all people to come to try to put their heads together on a hard problem is one of the most valuable things we can do.
Great. Any other reflections on that?
The only thing I completely agree. We're neutral in terms of we don't take one side politically, but we do care about outcomes and we do care about what we're trying to achieve with our impact funding. I think the other thing I would add to Mike around housing is also job creation and getting people training for jobs that have high growth. So I think that's another issue that seems to get bipartisan support. How do we get individuals into training that will get them a job that's both needed today and will have growth potential for tomorrow? And it can create some great dialogue between the government, nonprofit, and the private sector around what are the potential solutions. And I think the two go hand in hand. It's really hard to think that you can afford housing if you don't even have a good paying job. And so figuring out how we bring those two together to get people the jobs that will get them the income that they need and want to afford safe housing for their families.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Go ahead, Lindy.
So I say a lot that we in philanthropy, or at least at Rose Community Foundation, we are nonpartisan, but we're not necessarily neutral. And I can say we definitely have a point of view. When our goals are to advance equity and justice and to foster inclusion and engagement, we are going to line up with positions that are not going to be universally appealing. And I refuse to use our resources and our platform to only play it safe. And so that's why we've made significant investments, as my colleagues have, in vaccine equity and access. That is a divisive issue. I don't know why, but it is. But that doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We've been very active in the immigration space. Again, we didn't make it political. We don't view it through a political lens. We view it through the lens of the impact on local families and communities and children. And so that is how we access these issues. But at the end of the day, I think it's hard to find very many issues that aren't considered divisive. And we're very lucky here in Colorado. We're in a bubble. There are states right now who, are dealing with extreme attacks on voting rights, on women's freedoms. And these are all issues that we play in when necessary in Colorado. And we're not going to ever think that it's all good and we never have to work on those issues in Colorado. But I think, philanthropy is some are starting to get bolder and edgier and realize, it's not about pleasing everyone. We can't do that. But if we make decisions that are aligned with our values and the community's needs, and that's the lens we look at things, then we'll probably stay on the course that is going to be most impactful and beneficial to the community.
Great. Thanks for that, Lindy. I'm going to take us. I thought Laura Dunn has an interesting question that we all need to start taking on, because it's interesting. During this unbelievably challenging time, there's also been an enormous amount of government resources that are being put into some of these issues. And we're actually kind of starting to see the beginnings of what that cliff effect looks like with unemployment. A number of people who were receiving unemployment benefits as of this month or not, and who kind of started to depend on those resources coming in as our communities are experiencing this influx. And we saw it at Urban Peak when I was running Urban Peak during the 9/11 times, and we saw it during the fiscal crisis that we encountered in 2008, where these resources came in the community and they were there and then they're gone. What do we need to be doing as a community to really pay attention to that cliff effect, that when those dollars that are coming in to start addressing some of these issues aren't going to be there in 2 or 3 years, and could conceivably have a completely different economic climate than we do right now. Any thoughts or insights on that, or how you're thinking about that?
I was just going to share, I think, just in terms of the landscape, we went from this point of very organizations, I think to Lindy's point, that we're trying to address very basic needs, right? Like things that they had never done before, or maybe things that they actually did do, and we tried to actually encourage them not to do that if they were trying to do a bigger body of work. And so I think in this moment now, when there are these stimulus dollars coming in and they may have additional resources, I think all the organizations, and Mike talked about his fellowship. I think the Denver Foundation has had the executive directors of color for so many years. Is like, how do we now in this moment, actually where there might be some stability with nonprofit organizations, especially those led by BIPOC leaders that may have some additional resources, how do we build the capacity of those organizations and build the infrastructure and and strengthen the capacity of leaders when it does return to a time when sort of there isn't and not all of them are having access to that, but those that are having sort of more flesh and having additional resources. So I do think that this is the moment to think about, like, how are we shoring up the capacity, especially I think of the leaders of the organizations, and in particular I'm thinking about sort of BIPOC leaders in the space. For many, many years, just sort of at a very simple example, but I worked in the education portfolio, and we had an after school program, and, it was always, I had very few leaders of color that were leading, and those had the smallest organizations. They had the scrappiest, sort of programs, and they were often, and then you went to the space, these are the best leaders to be working in this community. And so I just think that is I think this is an incredible opportunity, actually, with some of these federal dollars to spend some time shoring up capacity of orgs.
Janet, I really appreciate that. And I've been thinking about it a lot as I've been watching it on the national level and watching grantees and whatnot. And I think that the one area that in the midst of a really challenging period of time for us, who are all doing community work, and all the folks who are tuned in today who are doing really good community work, there's this enormous opportunity in the midst of being discouraged by some of the things that we're seeing happening, that we can innovate and do things differently than we've ever done before. And that if we don't, I think Lindy's piece, if we don't put a stake in the ground and lean in, it's a missed opportunity. It's not just about how do we get through this, but what do we want this to look like in 10 years? That when we look back, it's like, that was an awful time. But from that, these 5 different approaches to how we engage with our nonprofits, the capacity that we created has created something much more significant. And I'm seeing that at the national level. I think the nonprofits that are rising to the occasion, as opposed to just trying to figure out how to get by. And I think there's a needle to thread there, because sometimes the most you can do is figure out how to get by when you're in a period of crisis. But how do we innovate from this? And so really, I appreciate your comments there, Janet. Anybody else want to add to that around the sustainability side of things, or how we're thinking about that before we?
Jamie, when you and Roxanne White were building Denver's Road Home, you did something revolutionary. You said success should not be measured by how many meals we can provide to the homeless, or how many more beds and year-over-year growth in those services delivered. Success is those numbers going down. Success is the need for the food and the beds going down, which was a revolutionary concept in the service provider community. And in this moment where there's all of these federal funds, coming in, and there are immense needs, my fear is, how do we prevent ourselves from saying success is 1,000 units of X this year, and 2,000 next year, and 3,000 the year after that, and get to success is the need for those units going down. And so how do we resist the temptation to build up an unsustainable infrastructure in the nonprofit or government ecosystems to address the current crisis, instead of using this opportunity and the resources to innovate and actually get to the systemic root causes so that the needs and the demands are less.
Thanks for that, Lindy. I appreciate it, and I've been doing a lot of reflection on the Denver's Road Home Days, and it was Roxanne and me, and it was another 1,000 people that were at the table trying to figure that piece out. And I think that and that there's so many things, especially when we're addressing issues like housing and affordability and whatnot. The message that I've always sent, and that Roxanne's always, Denver's Road Home was imperfect. There was loads of things that if we could go back and do it over again, we would do it differently. But there are things that we learned from that made us better at how we approach those things. And I think the time is now for us to figure out, how do we learn from what we're doing right now and build off of that, and really focus on achieving the goals that we really need to make sure we're accomplishing along the way, and keeping our eye on the prize. So thanks for that. Any other comments on that before we? I want to jump into Mark Turner and Joe Rice have been raising something I think we'd be remiss not to just briefly address before we start to wrap up our hour. But the role of the private sector, and where do they fit into the mix of this, and how should we be engaging them, or should they be engaging the community, and any insights on that with the work that you guys are doing right now?
I'll jump in with something we're doing right now. I think we have to understand that the private sector has different goals and priorities than nonprofits or even foundations. And I think it's incumbent upon us to find those issues that are relevant to them and to their work, and give them something specific to engage on. So for instance, we are looking at some financing to get individuals who are currently living in poverty, with an emphasis on individuals of color, into good paying jobs that have career growth potential. So we've done the data analysis to see what hiring has been going on over the past 5 years. Where do we see in-demand jobs? Do those jobs pay a livable wage when someone gets hired? Is there a career ladder? From there, we narrowed it down to where we see the most potential, and then have started to do outreach to the private sector to talk about their interest in, at a minimum, serving at the back end to help employ these individuals once they get the training. And in a best case scenario, could they help repay some of the training costs as a retention strategy? So just an example, I think you have to find what's in it for them, what is in their self-interest, in order to get them to the table and spend their time engaging on how we can actually improve our communities. And there's plenty that they care about and are willing to engage on.
Thanks, Kelly. I actually really appreciated the specific example around that too, just to give folks a sense of that. Does anybody else want to reflect or comment on the private sector piece?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll just add, I mean, this was a critical part of the vision of our founder, Sam Gary, who started Gary Community Ventures and just passed away last year. But his theory was that, business is always part of the solution. And I think, as Janet was talking about, more and more organizations that are seeing policy as part of the route to change, I think it's also true that a lot more of us see mission-based investing in companies that make an impact as also part of the solution. So I'll give you one example. We just invested in a company called Everyday Labs, which has built a solution to try to drive increases in attendance among low-income families for school districts. So they have a technology platform that sends you text reminders, sends you email reminders, can do robocalls, all in one prepackaged system. And it just happens they're a for-profit company, but what they have is a solution that, right now we're looking at third grade reading, how we get kids to read by third grade. Well, it turns out among the kids that are not reading by third grade, almost a third of them are missing more than 30 days of school a year. So one of the major problems is not how good is our teaching, how good is our curriculum, how well are our schools doing. If you can't get a kid in the door in the first place, we don't have a chance. And so we think that those business partners can be part of the solution. And there's a lot of good innovation happening in the for-profit world if we can harness it to do the work that we want to do in the places we want to do it. So I think for us, that's a really important part of the solution. And we expect those companies to be providing solutions the same way that our nonprofit leaders are.
Thanks, Mike. we're coming up on the hour, and so, but I want to actually, I'm going to end on something, and that I think is really important. I think if you watch any news station or read anything right now, it's quite easy to become relatively convinced that we're just about at the end of the world, and the end of days is at hand. And I could be terribly wrong. I don't think that that's the case. And I also think it's an unbelievably hard time. So I don't think it's a time to be Pollyannish or everything's fine, it's going to be okay. But I do think that there's hope. I look at the way that scientific community responded in creating a vaccine that the world had never seen. I look at the fact that a year later, you don't have to explain to a lot of people what an HBCU is. I look at the fact that I look in Uganda right now, and we have 40 full-time staff there, and every one of them was really nervous about getting a vaccine because they're frontline workers and they're doing HIV work. And I had to talk to them about how the process worked here and how I got a vaccine. I got a picture this morning from them. The last of our employees went and got their vaccine, and they were celebrating because we took time to explain to them what it was about and what it meant to do this and why it was important and whatnot, and answered their questions. And so I'm actually hopeful that people are learning and growing and figuring out how to work together. I really actually would like to end today as we go into the weekend. As leaders in our community, as you're taking us to the next level in this process, what are each of you most hopeful about in the work that you're doing as we look at a really complicated and turbulent time that we're facing? And we'll start with Mike, and then we'll wind down in the opposite direction.
So thanks. Put me on the spot, Jamie. I find a lot to be hopeful about. I have family that are on both sides of this specific divide, and I've had the same frustrating conversations Lindy described with, like, why do I have family members who don't want to get vaccinated, and what is that challenge? But what I hear most often in those conversations is more of a longing to be reconnected than I do an anger about the difference, right? It feels like when you're in an argument with your spouse or your sibling and you're not quite sure how to make up, but you wish that you could. I think there is still fundamentally a desire for people to want to believe that we can still solve the hard problems that we're facing, and that they would love to lock arms with someone who can do it. And I just find it takes the individual issues on which you can find that common ground as a place to stand. When you find that there is a place you can stand together and work on something you both agree on, whether it's Kelly's point about workforce development, like who doesn't have a shared interest in doing that? And the ability to then have the muscle memory of having taken on a hard project together, succeeded with people for whom you might disagree, and then say, okay, if we can do this, what else can we do? I think Colorado is a place that really can pull off some things that the rest of the country might not in this moment, and can be a real example. So I'm very hopeful that whether it's the next wave of COVID, whether it's the academic learning loss, whether it's housing, whether it's workforce, these are issues that really people care deeply about. And there's a chance to bring people together to solve them. And that, I think, is the best way to rebuild hope.
Nice. Janet?
Nobody wants to follow Mike. He's just a ball of hope. So that's what he's built. So I think it's sort of focusing on the question or the answer, Jamie, just in terms of philanthropy, is that I think philanthropy is really changing to think about what constituent leadership looks like. And I think, and just seeing, the new wave of leaders of color, from those who are on committees and those who are in positions of leadership and those who are on staff, and really thinking about, again, like what turning like inward to philanthropy, like, how are we perpetuating systemic racism? I think philanthropy has done that for a very long time. I think so many foundations are asking the really hard questions and starting to try to make the internal changes to then, I think, push out to external changes. So I'm hopeful about those changes as I look in the eco space now. I've been in this world for about 10 years now, so I'm excited to see those changes.
Thanks, Janet. And just for the record, I think you did an exceptionally good job of following Mike Johnston. Kelly, what do you got on the hope scale?
Yeah, so I share both Mike's hope and Janet's hope, and I'll add one more thing that makes me hopeful. It's young people. So when I look at our young people and I look at what they care about, what they're talking about, I see them being more inclusive. I see them looking at how we can actually be more, how we can change the awful course we've gone down with the environment. That gives me tremendous hope. Because what I'm seeing is they not only recognize the issues, they're willing to talk about the issues, and they're willing to do something about the issues that they care about.
Nice. Thanks, Kelly. And Lindy, we started with you. We'll wrap up and close out with your perspective on hope.
Well, starting with the incredibly tangible, in case you haven't seen the news today, Pfizer announced that they are weeks away from submitting data to the FDA for vaccinations for children under 12. So that gives me hope and relief, and but that's tangible. I think in the larger, I agree with everything that Mike and Janet and Kelly said. But I'll just focus in. What gives me hope is the fact that part of the conversation has been, it's not about getting back to normal. It's about building a new normal. The old normal wasn't good for everybody. And so how do we build back better? And the fact we're asking those questions in philanthropy, in nonprofits, in government, in the private sector, the fact we're asking those questions gives me hope. The proof will be in what answers we come up with.
Nice. Great way to round it out. And actually, I'm gonna, as the moderator, I get to go back and pick on Kelly's comment because it all ties into every one of your answers. And it kind of ties into what we started at the beginning. We were all 20 years younger when we knew each other on 9/11. And the people that Kelly's talking about, as part of my work with Emerson Collective this summer, we hired 127 young people from around the country, a lot of kids from HBCUs and young people who had never had an opportunity to have a seat at the table to participate in social justice issues. And I looked at those young people, and those young people that we were mentoring and guiding and doing this work are the ones that are going to be on this panel in 20 years, talking about how to deal with the thing that makes COVID seem much less complicated. And so I think that investment in how we do it, and each of you just knowing the funding and the philanthropy work that you do has really invested in that youth perspective. And so I think it's such a nice way for us to end. And so I love hanging out with you all. So I like watching Mike Johnston eat his lunch while we're having a panel discussion. I love hearing the different perspectives and the different jobs that each of us are doing. And I'm really excited about the people who joined in today. So for the 100-some folks who joined, I'm a tried and true soldier of the University of Colorado Denver and the School of Public Affairs. I think it does a great job of bringing issues that are important to light so we can be thinking about these in different ways. So 1,000 thank yous to Dean Teskey and to his team and to the school for bringing us together today. And thank you all for being here today. I hope you all have a spectacular weekend and a great start to the school year. We'll see you at the next First Friday.